Welcome everyone to today's webinar hosted by ECIS. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Jo Whitson and I am Head of Events here at ECIS. It is my pleasure to introduce today's webinar. We'll be sharing a recording of today's webinar and there will be an opportunity at the end to ask questions via the chat box. Now, let me introduce our experts for today, Monica and Bill. Monica received her degree in counselling from Older University in Chicago, in educational leadership and research methodology from Florida Atlantic. Monica's practices include individual, couples, and family counselling. She has been counselling practice for over 30 years in both private practice and serving as a clinical director of a hospital. She is a court-certified family meditator and parent coordinator. Her research has focused on resilience promotion interventions with at-risk adolescent females. Monica also serves as a professor of counselling and provides training in resilience-based counselling throughout the USA and Europe. And we have Bill. Bill received his counselling from Boston University and a PhD in counselling from the University of Arizona. He has over 50 years of experience in both mental health and education fields. His experience includes serving for 30 years as a professor of counselling and a department chair in a graduate counselling programme. Bill's professional experience includes serving as a special educational teacher, school counsellor, and mental health counsellor, working in agencies, private practice, and correctional settings. Please join me in welcoming and handing over to Monica and Bill. Thank you both.
Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to whichever one fits for everybody online. What we'd like to do today is, a short amount of time to talk a little bit about developing social emotional learning programs from a resilience-based perspective. And so what we'd like to do is sort of begin by from the general framework for developing program, and then work our way down to some very practical strategies, techniques for doing that, sort of, and here's how you could start tomorrow. So we'll try to take a general down there. You've got the split screen overhead. You'll be receiving that after the program, as well as opportunity to click on our webpage and download free our resilience-based social learning program activities, parents and teachers. So that'll give you about 25 specific lesson plans to get you started here. So with that, let's talk a little bit about this, how we look at it, resilience. People often talk about the 3 R's of education: reading, writing, and arithmetic. We'll suggest that the missing 4th R is resilience. We need all 4. And it's interesting to kind of look. Many times I've heard over my career anyway, that the idea of education needs to go back to the basics, which usually means reading, writing, arithmetic. But actually, if you look at the history of education, if you really went to basics, it begins with resilience on character development, moral education, who the person is rather than the academics. It's only been in the last probably 50, 60 years, we've moved towards academics and left that resilience piece out. And we start to see some of the problems with doing that. So let's talk a little bit then about resilience and what it is.
So welcome all, and hope, for everyone's health and well-being, and hope that we can introduce some of these ideas as they've been around for a long time. So just overview: the ability to set a positive, productive, fulfilling, and goal-oriented direction in one's life, while also not just being able to do academics, but also being equipped to handle the inevitable adversity, stress, rejection, failures, and setbacks. With the pandemic and the difficulties we've had here in the States, we certainly everyone has had so many adjustments and so many things they've had to, all the adversity that we've had to face this year. So the resilience is such a notion right now to be pertinent and to be practiced. And so the ability to bounce back up and continue to move forward in the same positive, socially useful and productive and contribute a direction in life. And what does in stride mean and bounce back? Looking at the levels of being in stride. It's examining the event or what's happening with the ability to encourage oneself, to believe in, to know that the adverse event does not define nor take away one's ability or worth. It is the notion of being on the learning curve, which we are always, every day, and staying encouraged with one's ability and self-belief. Another person or event does not diminish who we are. We also learn how to deal with adversity. We can learn and we can change our responses. And we'll talk a little bit about that. Wish we had 4 hours, but resiliency is response flexibility. We can react to emotional and physical distress with different coping mechanisms, and different responses can be practiced and learned.
We like to think of resilience as serving two functions. The first one, developing a resilience-based social emotional learning program, begins as a social vaccine. And there's a term we're all very familiar with these days, a vaccine, to prevent difficulties. We hear a lot about the importance now, the research is pointing out, of adverse childhood experiences, ACEs, and how they're at the root of many of the problems, from stress, anxiety, depression, substance abuse, and so forth with youth. And so we're really looking at, when we develop the resilience in a preventive basis, they are less susceptible to some of the problems of stress, adversity, and so forth. And especially those of you with the international schools, we sometimes overlook some of the difficulties, unique difficulties of kids and the what we call the international mobile family, or third culture kids lifestyle, constant moving, constantly readjusting, and also tend to come from families that have high expectations, high stress levels. And our research shows that kids especially children, adolescents, from high achieving schools with high achieving families, also experience tremendous pressure and stress about achieving at a certain level, and the competition from all that. And so that's another form of an adverse childhood experience that we tend to overlook. So a vaccine, one of my favorite kind of quotes is from a man named Jonas Salk, who of course was the one that discovered the polio vaccine back in the 1950s. That was the pandemic problem of that time. And on the 35th anniversary of his discovery of the polio vaccine, he was asked in the ceremony, if you were a young research scientist today, Dr. Salk, on what would you focus your research? And his response was an interesting one. He said, I'd still do immunization, but I'd do it psychologically rather than biologically. And that's exactly how we look at developing social emotional learning programs from a resilience perspective. We're trying to immunize kids against depression, pressure, the difficulties. We all were going to have stress, problems, setbacks in life. Are we equipped to handle it, get back up, and keep moving forward in a positive direction? At the same time, it's an antidote to counteract the adverse effects of stress, loss, trauma, abuse, maltreatment, failure, emotional pain, and so on and so forth. It's all kids, all humans will run into stressful situations, problematic situations, and some will succumb to that. But by developing this kind of program, we're finding now from our research that when you build in health into their lives, it does a much better function of helping kids improve, rather than the sort of traditional model that's out there is how do we control through medications or disciplinary tactics, whatever, to control the symptoms. How about building health so the symptoms are no longer functioning unnecessary, I should say. Okay, so what we look at is by developing through a social emotional learning program, the resilience in youth, it develops what we like to call their resilience quotient. It's their RQ. We talk a lot about IQs. Well, what about resilience quotient? And the research is pretty strong here. Research tells us that one's degree of resilience, or their RQ as we call it, is the best predictor of future success in all aspects of life, all aspects. It's the best predictor of how you're going to do in school and achievement, how you're going to do in college, in universities, how successful you're going to be in your career, and how successful your personal life is going to be. It's not your IQ, it's not your grade point average, it's not your degree of self-esteem, it's not your score on achievement tests, SATs, ACTs, A levels, and so forth. It's your resilience quotient. So we like to think of the formula is your RQ times your IQ. So if you have an IQ of 100 and an RQ of 1, that's a score of 100. If you have an IQ of 100 with an RQ of 10, then you're looking at 1,000. It's much more better predictor. And it's important to understand the history. As the saying goes, those who don't know their history are doomed to repeat it. Social emotional learning is not a new idea. We hear about it all the time, talk about it, but we've been down this road many, many times for many, not only decades, centuries. And here we are discovering it all over again. This famous athlete in the United States who has some very interesting quotes used to call it it's deja vu all over again. Here we go again. But this is the overhead. Aristotle said, educating the mind without educating the heart is no education at all. In the United States, one of the first two major academies open to the general public, if they could afford it, and if they were male and so forth. In 1781, at Phillips Exeter Academy, right here in our state, New Hampshire, they opened up Phillips Exeter Academy, and their mission statement from John Smith, the founder, was, above all, it is expected that the attention of the instructors to the disposition of the minds and morals of the youth under their charge will exceed every other care. Well, considering that though goodness without knowledge is weak and feeble, yet knowledge without goodness is dangerous, and that both united form the noblest character and lay the sweet foundation of usefulness to mankind. And it doesn't take long to think through many people who are highly educated, brilliant, but lack that sense of resilience, moral character, and how dangerous they've been in this world historically. We need to build both if we're going to develop youth who are successful in the world after their education. And back in the progressive stage, in the early part of the 20th century, there was a lot of movement at that time for social emotional learning, sometimes called then character education, moral education, and so forth. And one of my favorites is by Alfred Adler, who was one of the dissidents in the group formed by Sigmund Freud in Vienna. And he came back in the early 20s saying, we need to do more preventive work, vaccine work, if you will, with youth. He said, the teacher who takes time to work on a student's social development will find his, her job simultaneously amplified and simplified. It's far easier and more effective to teach a cooperative, responsible, well-adjusted child than it is to nag, threaten, and prod along the uncooperative, irresponsible, discouraged child. And I've never heard of an educator say, that's not exactly how I found it. I'll just kind of leave these pages for you, but you can kind of see the history of social emotional learning, character education, moral education, whatever you want. Through the years, we've had the progressive movement, the Deweys, the Montessoris, the Boscos, Italy, Horace Mann in the United States, and we have the teacher education. I even have a book here sitting that I found, 1905. There's the text for training teachers, whole chapter on moral education, how important that is in your curriculum. The 1920s book with how to teach courtesy in your classroom, such as it's inappropriate to ever dance in a bathing suit. I don't know why we're getting down that road, but it's, and in 1922, I think it was the Iowa plan that won $20,000 for being the outstanding character education program. I always find as we talk about back to basics, and here we are, the basics have always been about character, resilience, and so forth, not academics. But we keep losing it, and we'll move on from there. But you can see, World War II, the Cold War, it kind of derailed it for a while. Then we came back with the Developing Understanding of Self and Others, Do So program, values clarification, tribes in the 60s and 70s, derailed again with the Nation at Risk, No Child Left Behind, high stakes testing movement of the 80s, which kind of moved us to, it's all about test scores. It's not about who the student is, it's about their scores. And there I like to quote Batman, who said, it's not who I am, but what I do that defines me. Kind of look at what are you doing here. Then we've got the Quest programs, the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning, the CASEL program, which is more of a research institute here in the United States. And in Europe, you have the European Network for Social Emotional Competence, NSEC Europe, which is doing a lot for developing programs and social emotional learning. So with all these years, what has gone wrong? Why isn't this a central part? Why are we once again talking about social emotional learning as something new, a new initiative? And 10 kind of things that I see as being factors. So let's not make these mistakes again. They tend to be overly authoritarian. This is about how you should behave, which is not about the needs of the child, the adolescent. It tends to be more about the needs of the adults. It tends to be too limited in scope. Folks are teaching kids how they should act and not looking at the bigger picture. And we want to share the bigger picture today. There's what Larry Cuban has talked about in his book, Inside the Black Box of the Classroom. One of the things about education, people always come up with a new program. I'm sure everybody out there has had this, we have a new program, a new curriculum, a new text, a new idea. We're going to give you a one-day workshop on it in August, and then you expect to implement it in your classroom. And no one ever knows, once it goes inside your classroom, the door's closed, it's a black box. What goes on in there? It's the old saying from Las Vegas, what goes on in the classroom stays in the classroom. So what is the fidelity and how well does it get implemented? Does it get implemented? So kind of looking at how do we find out, how do we know if we're actually doing that? A lot of people resist a program that's thrust upon them and they're not well trained in, it's not theirs. One of my other pet peeves, have been in education now for 50 years, the idea of the one-size-fits-all off-the-shelf program. You can say, we need a social emotional learning program. Which one should we buy? And we've got lots of them out there, Second Step and the Quest program and so forth, the Tribes program. It doesn't make much sense. Teachers are too intelligent to leave them to, here's a program, just do what the program says. No two schools are the same. No two classrooms, 2 years in the same school are the same, especially in international schools where you have a constant change in school population. When I was an international school counselor, I was asked to look at the issue of using test scores. I informed them that you have to have at least 3 years of test scores of kids who have been in that school over those 3 years before you can test them. Otherwise, you're testing students coming from other schools, and that's a reflection of your school. And when we talk a little bit, the most we ever had in any classroom with children who had been there for 3 years in a row was 5. So if there's only 5 kids in the 7th grade, a 9th grade who've been here for 3 years, also takes us 1 high score, 1 low score. So an off-the-shelf program doesn't make much sense. They're changing kids, they're changing issues. We also fail to integrate academics. We use SEL as a add-on, something to also do. It needs to be integrated with academics. And we'll talk about that as we give you some methods to do that. There's also been the failure to involve parents, and especially international schools. So a lot of stress goes, it's hard for a parent to be encouraging, nurturing, building resilience when they're struggling with that. And they're constant changing cultures, languages, lifestyles every couple of years, being mobile around the world. That's very stressful. And especially when you're a parent from another culture. You're a Korean family living in Vienna and your kids are attending an American school. You can feel very isolated, confused, not connected in that way. So how do we help parents be resilient so they can help their kids be resilient? We'll talk about that by integrating parents into our social emotional learning programs. So we're all working on the same page. We also fail to address teacher social emotional learning. That comes first. Oakland, California School District tried to implement an SEL program, and the superintendent finally found out the reason it wasn't working is the teachers themselves had not developed a sense of social emotional learning. It's not part of their training as teachers. Yet the research shows us the real factor in the classroom and what makes a classroom effective is not the curriculum, it's the culture, the climate of the classroom. That's set by the teacher's relationship style. Relationships between teachers and students is the key. Research continually shows us there's a factor called the turnaround teacher. Those of you who are in positions such as school counselors and so forth, in administrators, you'll notice that there are certain teachers, I can put a child in that classroom, and no matter what their struggles have been, they're going to turn around and do okay. There are other classrooms, it's not going to go as well. So we've got to also address teachers' social emotional, teachers' resilience as well. Social emotion needs to be integrated with school culture. We talk about school culture. That's the factor that most identifies consistently highly effective schools, just as consistently highly effective businesses and corporations. As Jim Collins, who has studied long-term positive, successful companies, corporations, said, culture eats strategy for breakfast. We keep looking for new teaching strategies, new teaching techniques. But no matter how good the technique, the school culture will eat that strategy for breakfast. A negative culture, a non-supportive culture, a non-resilience-based culture, it doesn't matter what new technique, strategy, curriculum method you use, it's not going to work. We need to kind of address the culture as social emotional learning, a resilient building school and classroom culture. We need to also engage staff ownership. Engagement is one thing that makes programs work, that everybody feels a part of it. When it's a handout, off-the-shelf program, there's no staff ownership. Here's something else for you to do in the classroom. We're going to talk about the need to get everybody involved in developing their own social emotional learning program. We're going to give you a framework for that. But again, everyone needs to adjust accordingly. And of course, the ability to collect meaningful data for evaluation. Meaningful data said, what is our school? Not every school is the same one. Give you an example. One school worked with, they had an issue of average 250 referrals for bullying and fighting violence on the classroom per year. After implementing a comprehensive SEL-based social emotional learning program, by the third year that reduced down to 25 incidents as opposed to 250. That's meaningful data. Okay, that means a lot more time instruction. Okay. So let's give you the bigger framework. How do you develop resilient youth? And looking at the research, it kind of suggests there are 4 building blocks, and you need all 4 working together. So we're going to talk about all 4 in general, but then we're just going to focus on number 2, developing the essential social emotional competencies. But the first one is the availability of supportive, nurturing social ecosystems. All living organisms require a healthy growth, for healthy growth development, the availability of supportive, nurturing ecosystems. Plants, when the plant fails to grow, as most of the plants in our house and so forth do, it's not the plant's fault. We don't ask what's wrong with the plant. We ask what's wrong with its ecosystem environment. Is the pot too small? Is it not fertile enough? Too much sun, too little sun? Too much water, too little water? When fish start floating on their backs down the river, we don't ask what's wrong with the fish. We ask what's wrong with the water. When wildlife start to go extinct, we don't say what's wrong with them. We ask what's wrong with the ecosystem, food, and so forth. And it's the same with humans, except with humans, when a child's not thriving, we ask what disorder, what disease, what dysfunction they have, rather than what about what nutrients are missing in their ecosystem. And that's where the idea of resilience and supportive environments comes in. So children's primary social ecosystems are family, school, and community. In fact, a longitudinal study here in the United States over 12 years looking at youth and trying to predict what are the best predictors of health and wellness with adolescents. in terms of academic progress, aspirations, as well as least likelihood to get into destructive social behavior, from substance abuse to depression, anxiety, so forth. The two factors that came up best predicted was family environment and the school environment, equally powerful. The two of them working together were the best preventive measure, the idea of the vaccine. The second factor, building block, is we also need to develop certain essential social emotional competencies.
So the idea is in the competencies that you're developing as a full set is understanding and respecting self and others, and having the lesson plans that will forward to you have those ideas embedded in them, the development of that, the competencies and how to, the practical notions of making those things happen. Looking at the youth of today, having development of empathy when parenting plans and so forth and school environments, looking at how does my behavior affect others? How does my behavior affect my family? Or having children be able to identify, how's mommy feeling? How's my teacher feeling? How did I help today in my school? Who did I help today in my school? Communication, having positive, constructive, receptive, and expressive, and listening to understand versus listening to defend or argue. Listening to understand the person, having that empathy for others. Cooperation, working and playing well with others, which is the best predictor of future success. And responsible contribution. So many times, especially these days, I'm hearing more and more with children being stuck at home, that they feel like they have nowhere, no connection with other children, and no connection to be able to do the things, the leadership programs, the events that they used to have, the outdoor sports and competitions and things that they had that made themselves feel good, that they were contributing to help, maybe help grandma or help other family members. So the whole pandemic has really made it really more challenging.
Yeah, and to jump on top of that, I think what we're going to see over the next few months, as we hopefully start to come out of the pandemic situation, families have spent the past year kind of isolated, a lot of at-home learning, virtual learning. Kids have been isolated from one another. It's been stressful for everyone all around, not connection with socially, with family, whatever. Family for their extended family. And there's going to be a lot of need we're not going to go back to normal. We're going to have to go forward to a new normal and rebuild, having been through this. So I think over the next few months, the next year or so, the need for social emotional learning as part of our school programs is going to increase to get people back to a sense of reconnecting, developing these relationships. That's going to be when kids go back to school, schools open up a little more. Instead of this, various kind of strategies have been used with online learning and partial classrooms and so forth. The main thing is, as it is every first day of school, students are much more interested in who else is in my classroom, social connections, how am I going to stand here, not what's the curriculum, I wonder what kind of math program we're going to have this year. They want to know who is their teacher, what kind of a person is this, and they're going to want to know who are the other kids in my classroom, how do I fit in. So kind of taking that one step in front of it and developing those social emotional skills, relationships, that classroom climate, school culture is going to be more important than ever, even though it's always been probably the most important thing. So, and that counts to the families that we work with in our schools as well. The third then building block we talk about in developing the social emotional learning program is developing an optimistic growth mindset. The work of Carol Dweck and others, as Q and a number of other people have shown, the growth mindset, as opposed, schools tend to function from a fixed mindset. What abilities you have, what scores you have. We have diagnoses, whether it be a learning disorder, behavioral disorder, a conduct disorder. There's pretty much a label and a disorder for everybody here. as one leading psychiatrist put it, I can say it's a psychiatrist I never thought I'd agree with, but even he has said we've gone too far. So we've really reached the point of this no child left undiagnosed. We used to have no child left behind. We've really moved on. No child left undiagnosed. In fact, right now, under the new diagnostic manual from the American Psychiatric Association, the DSM, it's estimated by the age of 18, 80%, 80% of adolescents are eligible for at least one psychiatric diagnosis according to the manual. That means the abnormal kids are those mentally healthy ones. That's only 20% of the population, so they're abnormal. We're overly focused on a fixed mindset. What's wrong with you? Are you gifted? Are you, and nobody's totally gifted. We don't have many Da Vinci's out there. I may be gifted in one thing, very good at something else, and really a blithering idiot other things. We all have a range, but we talk about that. Abilities, talents versus disabilities, dysfunctions. A growth mindset doesn't say you are. It's focused more on effort, improvement, and progress. And you don't teach kids a growth mindset directly. What you do to develop a growth mindset reflects on the culture of the classroom, the schools, how we communicate with our children, with our students, where we focus more on effort, improvement, and progress. You are becoming, you're improving, you're getting better, you're working hard on that, as opposed to you are good, you are talented, you are smart. One of the great ways to develop a dysfunctional fixed mindset is through praise. Praise and criticism are the two best ways to mess kids up. Both say you are. You either have to live up to it or you're a failure, or we're saying you'll give up all hope, ye who enter here, you have a disorder, a disability, whatever it might be. So learning to develop a growth mindset in the communication pattern throughout your school is an important part of an overall social emotional learning program. And of course, the fourth one, opportunities to experience what we call the 5 criteria for positive self-identity. Researchers show that basically kids need to be in schools and classrooms and families promote a sense of social connection and recognition. I fit here, I belong, the number one human need, but at the same time, a sense of personal autonomy. I also have the right to be who I am, and that's encouraged. A sense of equality and mutual respect. I'm not only belong here, but I'm seen as an equal person of value. Fourth, they have an option to make a meaningful contribution. And a sense of competency mastery. There are some things I do well. And we'll get to that some other time, perhaps. Let's go back and focus on the next issue. Just quickly, I'm going to give you up there a list of nurturing social ecosystems. How do we develop these kind of things? And what the research seems to tell us, there are 5, what we call the maintenance tasks, because they're things we need to maintain. We talk about auto maintenance, we mean periodic oil changes and caretaking and washing the car and so forth. We don't do it just once and never again. A garden maintenance means you have to fertilize, water on a regular basis. Household maintenance, you don't just clean the house every March 1st, no matter whether it needs or not. No, you do it on a regular basis. Families need to maintain and address these things on a consistent basis. Number 1, is it safe? Okay. Failure to make it a safe environment where I feel emotionally safe, physically safe, verbally safe, psychologically and sexually safe in this environment, then everybody goes into defensive mode. And that's either fight or flight kind of mechanisms. That's called abuse, neglect, or maltreatment. So that's the first one. Is it safe? And we tend to over-focus on physical safety, sexual safety, and we forget that the real place most kids feel unsafe, in many environments it's hidden, is emotional, verbal, psychological safety. I'm not being criticized, complained, told I'm not working hard enough, and so forth. Estimate from research says if you took all the kids who were physically abused and maltreated, sexually abused, maltreated, add those together and multiply it times 2, that's a rough estimate of how many kids sitting in our schools also are dealing with emotional, verbal, and psychological abuse. And some other research coming out of, I think it was out of Yale, if I remember right. They found that it's in the high achieving schools. The kids do well, which is a lot of your international schools. The stress of high achievement, high expectations leads to some of the problems kids have in adjusting. It leads to things like substance abuse, depression, anxiety, all sorts of difficulties. Life skills maintenance, which we're going to talk about, social emotional competencies, which is your instructional part of your social emotional learning program. Cohesion maintenance. Here's an interesting, the one thing we consistently find in families, in classrooms, in schools, the number one variable that distinguishes whether this is a highly functional, consistently high functioning family, school, classroom, is cohesion maintenance, a sense of belonging, caring, mutual support. Do I feel at home here? There's our rituals and traditions. We play together. Research shows that to be minimally functional, you have to have about a 5-to-1 ratio, 5 positive interactions for every negative or critical one. Anything less than 5-to-1, we start to see dysfunction. And better is getting above 5-to-1. 5-to-1 gets you to the ratio of adequate. Nothing to brag about, but adequate. But a lot of our communication tends to be negative and critical. Behavioral maintenance, how we approach adjustment, behavior problems. We traditionally use disciplinary tactics in education that are more punitive, authoritative, controlled, suspensions, expulsions, so forth. Which research has shown over and over again are not only not useful, they are counterproductive, but there are other methods, so that has to be included in developing a nurturing social ecosystem. And of course, boundary maintenance. In this part of the country, New England, we have an old saying, this good fences makes good neighbors. I know where my boundaries are and people respect that, and I know where your boundaries are, and I respect those as well. So again, we can talk about another time, but just again, to talk about these things, let's make sure our social emotional address the issue of what is the culture of this classroom, this school, because culture eats strategy for breakfast. Okay. So how do we develop? Let's get down to the specific strategies of the classroom instruction and teaching social emotional competencies. Building block number 2. And it's a framework. We start with the assumption that all youth are born with the aptitude, an innate aptitude, to become resilient, socially emotionally competent individuals. But it's an aptitude that has to be developed by stage 2, which is teaching them the objective social emotional competencies in the family and the school, hopefully working together as a team, which is how public schools started to begin with. A partnership with families hiring a teacher to work with the help with their kids. Education. So teaching those objective skills, and we list from the research what we see as the 5 basic competencies. When you develop those competencies, it develops into a subjective attitude where I value these things. Am I being cooperative, understanding, empathic? And I make behavioral choices based on that. So I'll let Monica take it from there.
So one, just in respecting our time together, one of obviously having cultural awareness is something everyone on this workshop today has, and the other part is knowing thyself, knowing as a teacher, as a therapist, as a school administrator, or anyone affecting children and people around them, or culture, school culture. It's understanding, knowing thyself, knowing your triggers, knowing what arouses you, knowing what pieces bring that emotional arousal. So mitigating the arousal is just a piece I want to address just for a couple of minutes. Resilience growth means pausing when there's feelings of arousal. One of the most loving gestures in a marriage or in families is making sure your pulse rate is probably below 70 and being able to understand that your frontal lobe needs to be able to work when you're calm and regulated. Resiliency means creating a foundation and platform of go-to self-care mechanisms. Being able to know, like developing for children, one of the pieces that's very important is children knowing where their quiet, safe space is, knowing where they can go. I think some classrooms have yoga mats at the back, or they have cozy places in their rooms with warm blankets and cozy place, that I know I'm safe here. I know no one has expectations here. I know I can retreat here and I can calm down here. And that allows you to calm down and also find lovingness in your heart, which I think mommy and daddies can do, and counselors and everyone needs to be able to do. Is you cannot go two directions at the same time. You cannot be stressed and calm at the same time. In this moment of self-regulation, it's also a moment to create empathy, moments of thinking that if I continue in this pattern, I will create harm. If I am speaking and I am unaware of what parts are being said or what I'm communicating, then it's time to pause and stop. And by managing arousal and remaining reflective in the moment, being able to pause, you can return to calmness, go for a walk, take a shower, go for a run, go for a hike, and thereby interrupting the pattern, your pattern. We have developing so many stressful patterns and arousal patterns. And when you ask people, what are you upset about or what's being triggered? No one, half the time, people don't know. You don't know what's being triggered. But it's that moment of taking time to understand and solve the issue by examining, what do you need, or what does the couple need, or what does a family member need? Mitigating that arousal allows you to listen. And most of the time we're defending, or we're replying, retorting, and coming back with responses that we're not even sure why we're just in that pattern, because our emotional wounds that we've had from our past are being triggered. We all want to know that we have hope, respect, love, and that even though we may feel out of control, we are reacting in the best way that we know how, but we can always relearn. Interrupting our patterns of reaction by knowing and practicing many other ways to perceive, think, and feel. It's a change process. So it's a taking a moment, finding a pause. Even if you teach a child to count backwards and breathe, and then the breathing techniques, there's a variety of breathing techniques. And they're before responding, before speaking, in a family, in a school, in a couple. What do you need? What are the triggers? What are your partner's needs? And what does the other person need? Developing that sense of empathy. What do I need? But also, what does that other person need? And we're so busy defending from our emotional wounds that we're not listening. And what are three other solutions? Most of the time, the contextual issue of what we're talking about is not even really what's going on. We could be talking about ketchup choices, and yet we're getting animated and aroused because we feel like our wounds are being triggered. And those are parts that we need to be able to calm and be able to speak about. And what will I try? What can I do that's new as I pause and I have different ideas in mind?
Okay, so let's talk about, again, the skills of understanding and respecting oneself. Who am I? Understanding my emotional responses. This is the idea of the emotional intelligence concept. And of course, it's important to, as I said, until you know yourself, you really can't understand others. So the next skill we talk about is empathy. And one of the things is we're going to get into this, and I'll kind of hold up. This is a pamphlet that if you click on our Resilience Counseling and Training Center's website, which is located here, just www.resiliencecounselingandtraining.com. On the front page, you click. This is a 50-page pamphlet, which gives you a total of 25 basic classroom lesson plans for teaching several lessons in each of these 5 areas. This is a free download, so I feel like I'm doing an infomercial. Call now, limited supply, only $9.99, but the first 10 people get some steak knives or something. No, it's free. Just click, download it, and it gives you some examples of specific activities you can do tomorrow morning. They're lesson plans. I'm just opening up, for example, this one here is on, I don't know if you can see that. empowering others. It's a simple lesson. We talk about a young 9-year-old boy named Gilbert, struggling in school. He's kind of obese. The other kids don't interact with him. They make fun of him. He kind of daydreams. This is a typical kind of scenario. Kids make fun of him. His teacher once said to him, and this is true, Gilbert, if we could open your head, we would not find a brain, but merely a lump of white fat. Not exactly a growth mindset promoting communication between teacher and student, not a happy situation. So we started a discussion with the kids about, okay, how do you think Gilbert feels? What's it like to be treated like that? How do you suppose Gilbert would respond to his teacher's comments? What could a classmate do to help Gilbert? Okay, getting kids thinking about what can I do to help? What's going on? When I see a wrong being done, how do I step forward? After we do a discussion of all that and kids explore what they can do, we then tell them the rest of the story. Gilbert was an actual person. His name, we think of more as Gilbert Chesterton, who, by the way, he was also a non-reader, a couple of years behind other kids. Very poor student that way. One student befriended him. They became fast friends, and they found out that they enjoyed reading to another. Gilbert became the most prolific writer in the history of the 20th century. He's Mark Twain once said this, he's my idol, the person I look up to as the best, greatest author. So because one student stepped in and said, I can make a difference here. So we start talking about how we can develop these things. Then we have family. How do you get parents involved? When often suggest give parents homework assignments. That means a homework assignment for the parent to do to complement this. So I start getting parents thinking about the same thing. If teachers and parents are on the same wavelength, kids are surrounded in a much healthier way. So, for example, having parents write a short paragraph on who in your life has encouraged you. Watching movies like Schindler's List, Finding Neverland, Brian's song, looking up people who have made a difference. And in fact, I guess it was yesterday, today was the Holocaust Memorial Day. What a perfect time. I always say we study the Holocaust in the wrong way. We focus on the horrors. We forget to also talk about people like Sir Nicholas Winton, who saved hundreds of Jewish children in Austria and got them out of there. Okay, there's some question about he did steal the stationery, he did forge the documents to get them out of there. But when he was finally recognized for his work in the 1990s, it was estimated there are about 1,500 people on this earth that are only there because he stepped in to do something about it. All the Jewish population of Denmark was almost all of them saved because of two men, George Duckwitz in the German State Department, who was a career professional but did not believe in what the Nazis were doing, and Hans Hedtoft in Denmark, who got the word, they're coming, get everybody out of there. All the Danish pulled together, got all the Jewish population on whatever boats they have and brought them to Sweden and said, we'll take care of your homes, we'll take care of plants, we'll take care of your pets until you come back. And 3 years later, when they brought them back, they came home, back to homes where the plants were still watered, their pets had been taken care of, their homes were still intact, because when the Gestapo came to round them up, there was nobody home. They had taken care of. People made steps. Alex Goring is probably more familiar with his brother, who was Hitler's number 2 man. He used his name to forge signatures and notes from supposedly from his brother, to get truckloads of Jewish people out of Germany. And you have Pinchas, Tabor, Rosenbaum, and then throughout history, other people who saw a wrong being done and stepped in and did something about it. Those are the people we should be teaching about, celebrating. It's not about just the heroes of generals and so forth. It's what do people do? Who are people who have stepped forward and been the real heroes and acted? Another favorite activity is called Fractured Fairy Tales, where we read fairy tales in here, where The Blind Wolf, which is the story of Little Red Riding Hood, told from the perspective of the wolf. Okay, and it gives a very different picture of what really went on. This little girl running through the woods with a hood over her head, a hoodie on, and a basket all covered up. Obviously, a potential terrorist, and I need to protect everybody. And here she comes into her grandmother's house and thinks, "Oh, my poor grandma." What's the first thing she says? She starts making fun of her grandmother's eyes, her grandmother's teeth. It's a fun kind of story, but then as a follow-up, we start getting kids to write stories, talk about times when they were misunderstood. They didn't feel other people heard them, to write their own fairy tales from a different perspective. So they start training themselves to see things from other people's perspective. It's not always just the way they think it is. But these are just, again, activities. We talk about bullying and so forth. So 25 activities, free classroom lesson plans, the 5 skills of resilience, how to teach them in a classroom. Here are assignments you can ask parents to do, so they're also working with you on that as a possibility. While I'm doing commercials, we also have our book. If you go to our website, you can, this one will cost you $10. It's called Resilience in the Internationally Mobile Family. Great book, because I wrote it along with Peggy Pelotas, president of the American Community School in Athens. We talk about resilience building in families with internationally mobile families, and specific things you can do in a school to make it a welcome resilience building environment, nurturing environment, or ecosystem for parents, families of international mobile in the international schools, as well as specific things for parents to do at home to develop resilience in their own kids, in their own households, their own families. Very practical strategies. Again, another option with very specific activities. Here's what I can do to start developing a comprehensive social emotional learning program. Okay, so all those materials are there for you. I guess we can open up. Do we have some questions that you want to get into, or where are we, Joanne?
Yeah, thanks so much, Bill and Monica. It's been really, really useful. We have had a couple of questions come in. The main one is around kind of where can they get the materials you've mentioned, and so I will be sharing the recording of this video and also all the resources to you all, so you'll be able to gain access to those fabulous worksheets and booklets. We also had a question quite early on around, can you share more about the lack of safety and attention issues? How can the schools support children with trauma? Are you able to delve into that a little bit more?
Well, I don't know. Do you want to take that? Do you want me to take that? Okay. How to protect kids with trauma? I just think kids who have, we've got 2 ways to kind of answer it. Kids who have experienced trauma, or kids who are still experiencing trauma. We've got 2 different ways to it. They don't have trauma, they're experiencing it, or they have experienced it. And that's what we talk about resilience, social emotional learning programs as being the antidote to that. And what the research tells us is that no matter what kind of stress and problems and trauma kids have experienced, the best intervention is, do they have at least one healthy, supportive, safe relationship to counteract that. Bonnie Bernard, who's written a book called Resilience, What We've Learned, and kind of looked at all the research that points out that one consistent factor is kids who have been through the worst situations, as long as they have one safe, supportive environment, seem to do okay. Some kids do it because it's a classroom. It's a relationship with a teacher. It's with a coach, with some kind of a positive activity. Other kids find it through a family. Sometimes it's a neighbor, sometimes it's a not, and what we call the surrogate family. So they've seen an unhealthy, stress-filled trauma family, but they've also experienced a healthy family. And kids will go towards the healthy one. There was a study done of children growing up in some of the worst possible neighborhoods, drug-infested, crime, drive-by shootings. And what they found was, if those children came from a family that was safe and stable, the chance of them ever having difficulties in life was only 6%. But if it was safe, but unstable, meaning people were coming and going and so forth, the risk factor grew by 350%. And if it was both unstable and unsafe, the risk factor grew by 1,500%. So the question is, how do we make this a safe environment? That's part of developing the social emotional competence of teachers, be aware of these factors, changing our approach to how do we deal with kids who have experienced that, understand when kids have symptoms and problems, it's not because there's something wrong, some diagnosis, it's an oppositional defiant disorder. I've never understood how a child can have an oppositional disorder because it takes two to be oppositional. You can't be oppositional all alone. I've never seen, well, I guess there are some schizophrenics that can have arguments with themselves, but on that, I normally find two people are necessary, two or more. So it's looking at it, and we've received the research on the school to prison pipeline. We'll use suspension, expulsion, and so forth. Just go back to, in the United States, at least, we find that the peak of expulsions from school occur at the age of 4. Preschool children make up 70% of the children who are expelled from school. So what we have is children coming from trauma, family backgrounds. Our solution to it is to send them home for another year of trauma. No, we have to embrace them and realize how can we provide this a safe environment? Okay, how do we help kids learn to self-calm? How do we make sure this is a safe classroom environment? And we're training our teachers and staff on how to work in a positive kind of way. One of my favorite, for example, strategies used by one of my former students who's now developed a program called Passport to Peace, a social emotional learning program comprehensive at a school. One of my favorite things she did there was identify the positive competencies. We gave you the 5 here, and train this staff to say, anytime you see a child engaged in one of these behaviors, doing cooperation, doing something that's empathic and understanding, to hand them a sticker that they could put on their clothes and tell them, writing up in a sense a positive referral, this is what I saw you do and I want you to be recognized for it. From that point on through the rest of the day, this was in elementary school, every staff member, whether it be a cafeteria aide, whether it be a custodian, whether it be another teacher, they see a child with that sticker, they would just stop them and say, I see you've got a sticker for being understanding, cooperative. What did you do? Not congratulations, you're a good child. That's a fixed mindset. What did you do? And the child can say that. When they come home, first thing the parent sees is, my child did something positive today. That's what they're going to talk about. That's what they're going to ask about. So kids, again, we get the focus on the positive, the supportive. There's something positive about me, rather than here's the call to my parents of what I did wrong today at school. How about the call to my parents is what would positive today? How about a positive referral to the principal, the counselor? I just thought, this is what he did in the classroom, but this is the improvement, the progress. So this becomes that one place in the course of my day that I feel connected, supported, encouraged, a sense of a growth mindset. I'm getting better. I do have positive qualities. That's how you deal with the, in a nutshell, the child who's experienced trauma or is experiencing trauma. If they're experiencing it, then I also have to ask the questions about how can I help handle that? We also have to recognize sometimes parents are experiencing trauma. It's hard to be supportive of another person when you're dealing with difficulties and stress and so forth. So what are we doing to help families feel connected, and especially international schools? That's the one thing I found. We forget you cannot use the same program, the same approach you did in your school back in your home country when you work in international school. You have people coming in from all different countries, all different parts of the world, and they're moving all the time. They're constantly under stress. And I'd say especially the mothers, the accompanying parent. Now it could be the mother or the father, more typically it's the mother. They're the ones that kids get to school, they get the support. The chief breadwinner has secretaries and staff to help them at their workplace. The accompanying spouse is sort of plunked in on their own to figure out the language. I remember myself first time going shopping for groceries when I moved overseas and realizing they don't bag your food for you. And I just bought 20 cans of goods and I have to carry them home in my arms. that was a little bit of a shock. Brought in international students from other countries. And it's almost invariable that about a couple of weeks into their transition, oh, this is a wonderful thing. You hit the next stage is oh, damn, what have I got myself into now? And that we call it the disorienting dilemma. Should I go back home? Should I stay? What to do? That's when the schools need to help have programs, the school counselors and so forth, to make them feel that there's a connective and a supportive system, because you don't have the supports outside your school that you did back in your home country. So that's a quick, complicated answer.
Yeah, let me just say one little piece, and I saw some of the questions coming up, which is online resilience training, and it's often difficult to even, I know, get your students to come online, and especially the ones that are having trauma or their parents are having a hard time having their children actually be online. The after school programs, or somewhere where they open the schools, and I know with COVID, this is really difficult, but in the future, hopefully, that we're able to open the schools and have after school activities where each child is recognized and addressed and belongs somewhere, and that they're given some competencies to be able to train with some people to either have building chess clubs. I know one of Bill's students in Florida created what is called the LIFT program, where he takes disadvantaged youth and takes them into a huge warehouse. And in that warehouse, he teaches mechanical skills and woodworking and fixing cars and building houses and so forth, with group therapy. And I think that ability to be able to have those conversations and hopefully one day share a hug and be able to be close to people again.
I just saw someone talking about is in Florida, Project Lift. Yes.
There you go.
Yeah, that was started by another former student of mine, who developed that program, and it's now sent to the girls program. To me, when I talked about earlier about the essential components, the fourth category of the social emotional building blocks, one of the strengths of that program is these kids who are already into drug problems, crime problems, have this option in high school to come to this program after school. It gives them a healthy environment to go to. They have a family dinner together. Some who never had a family dinner together in terms of trauma. But they learn to fix cars. They learn to repair cars and so forth. And what do they do with those donated cars after they fix them? They give them away. So instead of being a person who's receiving services because of my disorder, I'm a person of significance. I'm a person who can make a contribution. I provide services rather than receive services. My favorite was early on, one of their students said, when they were giving the car away and the media was there taking pictures, they're giving this car they fixed to a mother who was in a shelter and had 2 young kids. I said, Mr. Bob, I'm not used to giving these away. I'm more used to stealing them. Very different experience, these kids. So that creating that healthy environment. What are we doing in our school? What are we doing in our classrooms? So we can't control what goes on outside, but we can certainly say, what are we doing to make sure this is a supportive, healthy environment for everybody here? And it's all of our tasks. Kids, again, are going to learn better when they feel safe in that environment. Executive functioning, the frontal lobes of the brain work optimal in a relaxed, safe environment. When you don't feel safe, when you feel constantly criticized, or rejected and stressed out, you're not going to learn very well. So what are we doing that? And that's where we got to get teachers on board too, think about, what is my climate like? What are the approaches? One of the worst things done to teachers by colleges of education is they prepare them in curriculum and methodology teaching, but they don't teach them how to work with kids in a positive, encouraging way. And what is the number one reason why teachers and school administrators leave the profession, which they do in very large numbers? I think it's almost 50% in the first 5 years. It's about working with kids. It's tough. Coming from all these backgrounds, types of trauma, difficulties, different cultures, different experiences. It's hard. Someone once said, I think it's Larry Cuban in his book, it's easier to send a rocket ship to the moon than it is to be a teacher. Because a rocket ship is strictly mathematics and work it out, and it's a straight line kind of thing. teaching in a classroom with all these different variables and they're always changing, and it's a little more complex. And that's why we, and there's a saying by H.L. Mencken that for every complex problem, there is a simple, clear solution. That's wrong. And when we think about social emotional learning, that's what we're trying to say, it's more comprehensive. It's not a matter of picking up, we'll take the next step program or the tribes program off a shelf and plug it into our school and that'll solve the problem. No, it won't. That's a simple, straightforward solution to a complex problem. It's doomed to failure. We need to think more comprehensively. What do we do about our classroom cultures? What are we doing about our school culture? How are we working with families? And how are we teaching? And when we say teaching, we're going to give you lesson plans. But of course, kids learn more with their eyes than their ears. They watch. Am I modeling this kind of encouraging kind of thing? Growth mindset producing. Am I making my classroom a place where you don't have to be afraid of being criticized, ridiculed, punished, threatened? I'm going to call your mother if you don't behave and tell her what you did wrong at school. No, there are better methods to do that. It's got to be a comprehensive program or a comprehensive problem.
Thank you so much. I'm gonna have to wrap up pretty soon. It's just about 5 past the hour. But I think just from judging by the questions, and it's been an incredible session, and I think that we could speak for hours on this topic. So maybe we should try and organise a kind of follow-up webinar in more of a discussion format. So I'll look to arrange that with you guys if that's something you're interested in.
That'd be great.
I will send out all of the resources to everyone who have attended today, along with the recording, and I will also share Bill and Monica's direct email address, so you can get in contact with them directly. Because I know there's a few questions that we didn't get round to addressing today. But thank you both once again for your time, and we would love to have you back to speak with us again soon.
Joanne, let me just again, people want the materials, the further information, just go to our website, resiliencecounselingcenter.com. Right in the front page, all the resources we've talked about are there to download, order, whatever you want to do. And don't hesitate if there's a specific questions you want some help with. I think on the front page, yes, our email. And feel free to send us an email with a question. We're glad to provide any help we can. There's a lot to accomplish out there. Whatever we can do to be assistance, don't hesitate.
Wishing you all health and wellness.
Thank you once again both. Thank you all for attending.
Thank you.
Bye everyone.